Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome CEO of the Milken Institute, Mike Klowden.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. You've reached roughly the midpoint, at least for those of you who just began yesterday, the midpoint of the Global Conference Marathon. I want to extend my admiration to all of you for the vigor with which you've shown thus far. You've got a long way to go. We have a spectacular day and a half ahead of us, including panels we've added on Wednesday. We're going to start Wednesday off with Paul Ryan. We're going to be including former Secretary Robert Gates. We're going to, at the end of the day, we have a panel that not only talks about Africa and the Middle East, but we also have Cory Booker here, bookending, so to speak, the day. So we've got a spectacular day and a half ahead of you. But before we move on, I have to do something I have only had to do, I think, twice in the 17 years I have been responsible for the Institute and this event, and that is to apologize. Because as the CEO, I am responsible for anything that goes wrong. My team is responsible for everything that goes right. And it's raining. And I'm sorry. I tried my best. I thought I had the fix in. It didn't happen. So my apologies for that. All right. While we're getting ready to start our panel, we have to have at least one quiz question, maybe two. So as we talk about global prosperity, and we talk about many of the issues that cut across the world being in transition, one of the key issues is immigration. And we talk about immigration not only in terms of inbound, but we also have to look at outbound migration. So let's ask you a question. We're going to go back to 2015, which is the last year we have accurate data for. And we're going to ask you a question about it. Now, when you get the answer, okay, you're going to text to the number I have there. We'll put that up again. But in 2015, which country had the largest number of international migrants, approximately 16 million, living outside of their country of birth? So was it Mexico, India, Bangladesh, Russia, or China? Okay. Now, let's show that slide again so you can give the answers. Okay, you text to Global 2018. You enter 22333 to join, and then you text in one of those answers. We're going to give you just a minute. Let's show the question again and the possible answers. All right, let's start getting those answers in. Let's see how we're doing. Okay, well, all right, no, it's sort of neck and neck, back and forth. Let's watch this for another minute. Now, don't be influenced by what you see other people voting on. I must say that what's perceived as an anti-Russian bias in the West is showing up once again. Not saying it's an accurate bias, but it's perceived as that. All right, we're going back and forth. It's very interesting. It's very close. We're going to close it off now. All right, so is it Mexico, India, Bangladesh, or China? And the answer is India. All right. Okay, now I have another question for you, but I think what I'm going to do is save that for tomorrow. And I won't even tell you what it is, so you can't start doing homework for it. But instead, we're going to move to our panel. Our luncheon panel today is promoting prosperity in a world in transition. And we have a wonderful panel for you. We have former Congresswoman Jane Harman, who's the president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. We have Dr. Yong Kim, who's the president of the World Bank. We have Tidjane Thiam, who is the CEO of Credit Suisse Group, and we have the chair of the Milken Institute moderating, Mike Milken. Please come and join us.
So good afternoon, and for many of you who came from 64 countries, you've come from around the world, but it's taken us a long time to get here. So I'd like to kind of review the last 4 billion years in 2 minutes, if we could. Let's take a look at this video. So we thought we were only going back to the start of Earth, 4 billion, but we took you back 13.7 billion years. Now today, we have such an exciting group that we've assembled here who've had responsibility throughout most of their professional career to help change the world in so many ways, whether it was political leadership, whether it's been leading financial institutions, health institutions, etc. And I'd like to go back to a slide that we've shown to you numerous times, and this was the formula that I had written in 1965 at Berkeley. And this formula, P then, little did I know that we were going to call this panel, 53 years later, Promoting Prosperity in a World of Transition. But P stood for prosperity. And as we look at each of these elements, each of our 3 panelists has been involved in numerous ways in access to financial capital, FT, different forms, building human capital around the world, building social capital, rule of law, creditor rights, universal suffrage, etc., and trying to create real assets, physical assets that would expand the world. And so, yes, it's 53 years later, and the world has changed, but the same concept of prosperity that I was focused on in 1965 is with us. So as we think about today's theme, a world in transition, and we explore some of the world's challenges, I just want to anchor this by saying prosperity is the best medicine for most of what ails us. So we're spreading prosperity to more people around the world which is the mission of the Milken Institute and the subject of our panel today. And with that background, I'd like to get started, but I often, when I financed a company, I wanted to know and understood what that company stood for, what its leaders stood for. What does Credit Suisse and World Bank and the Wilson Center stand for? But in order to know that, we also need to know how we got here. So Jane, I'd like to start with yourself. Coming out of New York, coming out here, going to school at University High School in California, back on both sides of the coast, tell us a little bit about the journey you took that allows you to be qualified and build the Woodrow Wilson Center today.
Well, first of all, thank you for including me on this panel where there are real experts on both sides of me. I'm just a recovering politician and a recovering lawyer. But I was looking at your chart, Michael, and it started with dinosaur, or pretty much did. I am one. I'm a centrist Democrat. So, at any rate, what was my journey? I had nothing to do with moving out here at age 3, but both parents were refugees. My father fled Nazi Germany, came here, became a successful medical doctor. I think the significant event in my young life as a public school kid, K through 12, growing up in West Los Angeles, was that I attended the Democratic Convention here in 1960. I'm not kidding, I am a dinosaur. And got on the floor of the convention, no security, it was really easy, and was there when John Kennedy was nominated for president. I also met Eleanor Roosevelt, and I was a student usher at the Coliseum, which was where Kennedy made his acceptance speech. And my personal light bulb went off, and I loved politics. And 32 years later, I was elected to the United States Congress, where I served for 9 terms. And from there, let's
talk about that.
Okay.
And a little stop at Smith College along the way.
Why do I deserve this? Okay, so I'm a public school kid graduating from Uni High, and I always was, still am, an iconoclast, so all my friends were going to UCLA or Berkeley, your alma mater, or Stanford. Therefore, I was going some other place. And I applied early decision to Smith College. Back in the day, for those who remember, there was no access to Dartmouth for women. There were 7 sister schools, and Smith was one of them. And I was accepted, and I headed off by bus, go figure. Had never seen the place, and went through a series of majors. Started with physics. I had placed into AP physics, and then moved to architecture, which I still love, but ended up in government. Why wouldn't I? Because I loved politics. I had worked in local political races in Massachusetts, and the interesting thing was, in my scientific way, I'm trying to be like you, Mike.
Well, first you went to law school.
No, I'm telling the story. Okay. So I figured out that a third of the people who serve in political jobs, especially in Congress, and it may be higher, are lawyers. Therefore, I should go to law school. Smith didn't offer the law boards. I had to go to Amherst to take the law boards, because back in the day, although there were some women in law school, it wasn't a sought-after occupation. And then I went to Harvard Law School. And life has been rich, full of politics, full of interesting jobs so far. And 7 years ago, I made the decision that the offer to leave Congress in the middle of my 9th term to head the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, a 50-year-old think tank, one of 2 living memorials in Washington. The other one is the Kennedy Center. This one is dedicated to Woodrow Wilson, our only PhD president. How many of you knew that?
That's going to come in.
He knew. It was an incredible honor, and I'm doing it, and I still love coming home. So thank you for this conference in my hometown.
Thank you, Jean. And could you just give us one word on the mission of the Woodrow Wilson Center?
Yes. It was formed to fuse Wilson's 2 passions. He was an academic for most of his life. He became president of Princeton University, and then governor of New Jersey and president. And his two passions were scholarship, which certainly applied to him for all those years, and policy. And we fused those two. We have 14 mostly geographic programs focused around the world. We are a whole wing of the Reagan Building, which is the largest international building in downtown Washington. And we are very proud of the fact that the think tank rating service, which is based at Penn, has rated us #1 in regional expertise in the world out of 6,500 think tanks.
Congratulations. Okay, well, we're now going to travel to the World Bank and Dr. Yong Kim, and born in Korea, family moves to the United States. Give us a little feeling for the path that takes you today to the head of the World Bank.
Well, like Jane, my parents were both refugees. They were refugees of the war. My father came by himself, and right when the border between the northern and southern half of the country was locked down, he had a friend who was a border guard. So he crossed when he was 19. He'd finished high school. He had his high school transcript, and he somehow got into dental school in Seoul. And so went to dental school, went into the Army, and then a very kind Army dentist somehow found him a scholarship to go to New York University to study periodontics. And so he was the first periodontist in Korea. But he met my mother in New York, and because she had been the top student at the top high school in Korea. There weren't that many of them. And she had got a scholarship also to go to Scarrett College, which was in Nashville, Tennessee. So they met in New York. My brother was born there, and then they went back to Korea. But it's one of the things, the stories that I've been telling a lot lately, is that they got a sense of what being a middle-class American looked like. And so they adopted middle-class aspirations for our whole family. And Korea was in a really difficult time. They were both professors at universities, and there were demonstrations against the military regime, and there was tear gas wafting up to our house because we lived near the universities. And so we came back to the United States. And the reason I tell that story is because our family was one of the very few families in Korea at that time who'd seen how Americans live. And so we were among the very few who had aspirations of sort of joining this, what at the time seemed like just an impossibly advanced society compared to war-torn Korea. But what I see everywhere now, because broadband is going to be everywhere very soon, is that the entire world is about to have middle-class aspirations. And so I think about that every day, because if we don't find a way to meet those aspirations, we know what happens. We know what happens in terms of fragility and conflict and violence. And so for me, the race to try to give everyone the opportunity that my family had, it really defines what I do. But we went to some crazy places. My father, when we came back, my father had to do his dental training all over again. So we went to Dallas, Texas, where he finished at Baylor University. And then for some reason, we moved to Iowa, right? I mean, so I usually tell people, I grew up in Iowa. You can probably all tell by looking at me, I grew up in Iowa. But it was sort of deep in the heart, of the Midwestern experience. And my graduating class was about 1,000 people. 10% went to college, and of the 10% that went to college, 90% went to community college. So there were just a handful of us who went to university. And my friends would say, so Jim, are you kidding me? So you're going to pay to go to school longer? I just got a job at the steel mill, getting paid $20 an hour. I bought my first house. I bought my first truck. You're idiotic. Why would you go to college when you can start, your real life now? And so, those guys are not, the steel mills have not done very well. And so, when I think about, that part of my background, I also understand the other piece of it, which is that there are a lot of people who are very unhappy because, you know, the idea was, I'm going to go to the steel mill, I'm going to buy a house, I'm going to buy a truck, and my kids are going to do better than me. But I don't think a lot of my friends feel that way right now. And so we have to balance that. Somehow, you know, I've got to run like crazy to try to create opportunities for the 8 billion people who are going to have middle-class aspirations soon. And on the other hand, we have to find, you know, what are these guys going to do? I don't think a lot of my buddies who worked in the steel mill for so many years are going to learn how to code, right? So what do?
So you skipped over Brown and a couple stops at Harvard, president of Dartmouth. Why don't we just touch base a little bit on those?
Well, I started at the University of Iowa, right? And then just before I started at the University of Iowa, I did a summer program, and I did a summer program at the University of Iowa science program. You know, it was a summer science camp. You know, how nerdy is that? But then I met these kids. These kids came from Long Island, from New York. They were urbane. They were incredibly sophisticated. Some of the kids were Jewish, and they came to me, and they sort of it felt like, oh my God, you know, these are my people, because, you know.
You were part of the lost tribe, right?
Right.
I just, you know.
13th.
The focus on it, and they would tell me this, right? So these kids would tell me, don't you know that there's this incredible symmetry and incredible similarity between Jewish culture and Asian culture? And, you know, these kids knew more about Chinese and Korean food than I did. I mean, they were, and so I just thought, you know, what am I doing? And it was like, you know, it was like Beverly Hillbillies. You know, my friends at the summer science camp said, "You're going to the University of Iowa, right?" It's like, you know, Jed, get out of there. Come to the East Coast. So I applied for transfer. I got into Brown. I went to Brown, graduated, ended up doing an MD and a PhD. Let me tell you the MD and PhD story. So I was really into politics. I was, you know, we hung out at the Third World Center. We like marched and protested. It was the coolest thing on earth, I thought. And so I came home I think it was in May after we finished the semester, and my father picked me up and he said, "So Jim, what are you going to study?" And I said, "Dad, I think I'm going to study philosophy and political science. I want to go into politics." He pulled the car over the side of the road. And he said, "So Jim, when you finish your residency, you can study anything you want." Right? So now the thing is, you guys laugh, but I've told this story in front of a group of Asian parents. Nobody laughs, right? Of course, you know. So I did the next best thing. I went into a program where I studied medicine and anthropology, and then met a guy named Paul Farmer, and we started this organization, Partners in Health, that's still doing great today. And by the way, there's a movie that was made about it recently. Thank you. And then, you know, so the life path was, and when people say to me, "So what's the secret?" There's no secret. It's just I was in situations where people asked me to do things that I think most other people would think are just outrageously above my head. So I just said yes to challenges that most people thought I couldn't handle, right? So, you know, I was, you know, we took on the World Health Organization. We took on all these institutions. We fought for the right of patients to be treated for HIV and TB all over the world. I helped a guy become Director General of the World Health Organization. I ran his campaign, so I went and worked there. And then out of the blue, they came and asked me to be president of Dartmouth. I'd never set foot on the Dartmouth campus, right? But a bunch of really smart people came, and so I just said yes, and was there for 3 years. By the way, you know, when you've dealt with the Dartmouth Greek system, you can handle anything, right? So it was great training for me for 3 years.
Yeah.
And then, Tim Geithner called me out of the blue. So Tim Geithner was the Secretary of Treasury, and he was also a Dartmouth grad, class of '83, and I knew Tim well. And whenever he calls, it was almost always because he had some friend that had a kid who wanted to get into Dartmouth. So I had a pad of paper. I said, "So Tim, what's the kid's name?" And he said, he said, "Jim, how would you like to be president of the World Bank?" And I said, "You mean the World Bank, right?" He said, "Yeah, why not?" And I said, "Well, I wrote a book that said we should close the World Bank." And he said, "That's okay. Just why don't you come down and see President Obama?" And I said, "When?" He said, "Well, can you come down tomorrow?" Right? So I went in, and in the interview with President Obama, he looked at me and he said, "So Jim, why would I nominate you to be president of the World Bank? I mean, why would I nominate you? Why wouldn't I nominate a macroeconomist?" And I said, "Well, President Obama, have you ever read your mother's PhD dissertation?" Right? Because when I saw this guy, Jane, you'll remember the 2004 speech, John Kerry's nomination. I was obsessed with this guy, and I'd learned that his mother was an anthropologist. So I was one of like 10 people who ordered her dissertation from the University of Michigan archives, right? So I had actually read every word of her dissertation. And so I said, "Well, President Obama, you'll remember that your mother said that all the economists, all the development economists said that the Indonesian artisanal industry would be destroyed by globalization. But in her 1,000-page dissertation, she showed that globalization led to the flowering, the expansion, rapid expansion of the Indonesian artisanal industry." And I said, "I'm not going to be able to tell you, what the world looks like from 30,000 feet like a macroeconomist, but I can tell you if the programs are working on the ground, because that's what I've been doing my whole life." He said, "Okay, I get that." Later, I was at a more informal gathering. We were having drinks around a table, and he looked at me and he said, "Jim, that was one of the best ploys to get a job I've ever seen."
And
all true stories, I swear. Yeah.
And Jim, the mission of the World Bank?
End poverty and boost shared prosperity. That P that you have right there, Mike.
Tidjane, tell us about growing up in the Ivory Coast. And how it prepared you to be where you are today.
I've been hyperventilating here. I'm kind of both terrified and humbled. Mike calls you and tells you, "Okay, you're going to be on a panel." You come here, and then he explains to you that there's about 4,000 people listening.
Yeah.
Okay. And then he explains to you that you're going to talk after Jane Harman and Yong Kim. And so I was listening to them and thinking, how do I talk about my life? Because 20 years ago, I was a cabinet minister in West Africa. I'm now on my 10th year as CEO, running my second Fortune 500 company. I don't know. It's, let's say, unusual. An unusual path. No, I was born in the Ivory Coast. A few similarities. Jane, your parents came from Europe. Your parents had the thing in Korea. My father took it from the other end. He was in politics. In the 40s, 60s, 40s and 50s, a journalist. So of course, journalism leads to politics, and politics in the third world leads to trouble. So he got into trouble. And he was a cabinet member. And I often make the joke that I'm one of those few human beings who can describe you the first time I met my father, because the first time I met my father, I was 4 years old, because he was arrested when I was 9 months old.
Wow.
And there are no visitation rights. So my mother used to show me this picture saying, "You do have a father, you're like most kids. You can't see him, but he exists, and someday he'll come back." And he was put on trial, acquitted, and freed when I was 4. So I was playing in a yard, and I saw this guy coming out of a car, and I said, "Oh, you must be my dad." "I've seen your picture somewhere." He said, "Yes." So that was the beginning, and then we got shipped to Morocco. Cut long story short, for many reasons, but we got shipped to Morocco. So I'm always terrified when people say, "Where did you grow up?" And I say, "Well, I don't know, a number of places." And Africa, in the 60s was a very exciting place. A lot going on, but politics was everywhere. You know, I remember seeing the plane of the King of Morocco chased by 2 fighter jets in 1972 above Rabat, and being in the garden and watching that. So you can't ignore really politics, and it's everywhere. After that, cut long story short, I've always been interested in development. I spent 1 year at the World Bank early in my career as a young professional, and I left because you hadn't arrived yet. So, anyway, after 1 year, because I thought, like you at the time, the World Bank should be closed. So I'm glad that it has, as a leader, somebody who felt that, because I think that's the right way to look at it. And after that, various things led me to London and running companies.
So you went into the financial service industry, particularly first focused on insurance. What led you into that career?
I'll give you actually an honest answer. One thing I learned, I cut the long story short. I was a minister, then there was a coup, then I was arrested, etc. So after all that,
And that prepared you for the financial industry.
I have a funny memory, so I remember a lot of things. I remember that movie with Idi Amin Dada in 1975, and they were talking to him about a young minister who'd been to Oxford and was very bright, and he looked at them and he laughed and he said, you know, he can do many things, your minister, but I will tell you one thing, nobody runs faster than a bullet. Yeah. So, during the coup, I kept thinking about that. Nobody runs faster than a bullet. So anyway, no, after all that, I decided two things, that I would apply my dad's advice for a career. You know, I said only two things matter. You have to like what you do, and you have to like the people you're doing it with. And I'd broken one of those rules to go into politics and work for a leader I don't really much care for, and I did it in disaster. And after that, I said, I'm only going to work for bosses I like and respect. And I was approached by a CEO at the time. It was Aviva in London. I got a headhunter call. I was in Paris. And frankly, I'd gotten tired of taking interviews in Europe because it was always the same story. I would come in and they say, oh, you have a nice 10 years at McKinsey, good resume, the schools, da, da. But, you know, we don't think our staff is ready for somebody like you yet. That was tended to be the excuse. So when this guy called, I told him, look, fine, executive committee, FTSE 40, all that sounds great, but really, I'm tired of being a token in an interview process. Okay, I'm now 40. You tell him, if he's really going to give me a shot at the job, bring me in. But tell him I'm 6'4", I'm francophone, I'm black, and I'm not going to go to London unless I have a real shot at the job. Okay? So when I walked in, he said, no, you have a shot. I came to London, I walked in, it was Richard Harvey. I really admire this man immensely. And he said, so you're the one who thinks I'm a racist. So that's how I joined financial services.
Prudential Insurance, large organization, large assets, enormous responsibilities. Tell us about that experience before you went to Credit Suisse.
Well, that was really interesting because I always tend to say that in the end, in business, you can only succeed if you are riding something real, a secular trend in the economy. It was my belief that the middle classes, the growing middle classes in emerging markets needed protection. It was my belief that the welfare state had bankrupted European economies, and that by making unaffordable promises to the population, both in terms of healthcare coverage and of retirement, those countries were basically economically bankrupt. So it was actually key in the development phase for a country not to subsidize its middle class. So my pitch to the Asian leaders in particular, I was very focused on Asia, is look, you've got those millions of people entering the middle class. Please don't do a Europe 1945, okay? They are the ones in your economy who won the lottery. They can pay their own way. Okay? And I will bring Prudential to your country and will provide a proper safety net for these people. It's a win-win. Okay? You'll have a fiscal surplus. You will not have a budget deficit. People of this emerging class will pay their own way, and we'll provide this at a cost that is lower. In Indonesia, we covered millions of Indonesians at a cost of 9% basically of their income, which was a better performance than what the European systems could afford. So that was the central idea. Then we implemented that quite successfully, and the company did very well.
The mission of Credit Suisse?
Initially, it was a turnaround, because it's a company that was created in 1856 by Alfred Escher. I say he's one of the few bankers who has his statue in public squares across Switzerland, because people forget Switzerland was one of the poorest countries in the world. It only exported people. That's why they had mercenaries. That's why the Pope's Guard are Swiss. It was so poor, it only had its people to export. And they were exploited by European banks. So Alfred Escher created that bank to fund the development of infrastructure in the Swiss economy, which would allow economic development. So the bank had come to quite a bad place with very little capital and a lot of issues. So I'm a bit like you, I take jobs that are a bit challenging. So initially it was a turnaround, but now the bank is in a much better place, and it's really being the bank for entrepreneurs, in one sentence.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to switch for a moment to United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And it required significant financing to achieve many of these goals. In telecommunications, estimate $361 billion. Energy, $289 billion. Transport infrastructure, $189 billion. Access to water, sanitation, $28 billion. But they set out 17 goals. And if we could take a look at what those 17 goals are, they start with no poverty, zero hunger, and it continues. And I think what we'd like to do to start to talk about prosperity is our panelists today have identified 6 goals they'd like to talk about. And Jim, why don't you start with good health and well-being, number 3.
Well, one of the things that we're looking at now, around the world, there's just not enough money. You mentioned it, Mike, and in the context of this notion that the entire world is going to have middle-class aspirations, the Sustainable Development Goals capture pretty well what we'll need to do if we are to give everyone a chance and a decent living. And the bill for that is $4 trillion a year. The total bill that we figured is about 4 trillion, 3-point-something trillion dollars a year. So how are you going to possibly get there? Now, this is why I come now every year, Mike, and I've been very grateful for the opportunity to come and share ideas, because there is a huge win-win situation. There's so much capital that's not earning very much, and then there are these opportunities that we know in a way that in a manner in which we can manage the risk, that you can both have a very good return and have a huge impact. That's really the only hope that we have of reaching the goals. Now, it's easier to bring private sector financing in for things like infrastructure, but for health, what we found is that if you take learning-adjusted years of schooling, meaning we know so much more now about learning outcomes in all the countries in the world, and then you add into it health outcomes, which again, over the last 10 years, there's been an explosion of knowledge about health outcomes. And then you look backward 25 years, the correlation is very powerful. If you look at the top quartile, the top 25% of countries that have improved their human capital the most, and compare it with the bottom quartile, the difference is 1.5% of GDP growth per year for 25 years going back. So now, this is precisely what the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, a teacher of mine, has been saying for a long time, is that the countries that have gone from poverty to wealth are the ones that have invested in their human beings early. Japan did it, Korea, China now, Vietnam. China and Vietnam are going to do very well on our human capital ranking because they have invested in their people. So for health, the stuff that you're doing, Mike, is so interesting, because I think that it's possible that we actually could dramatically improve everyone's health because of the new technologies, but it's not going to happen until heads of state and ministers of finance understand that it's important to do it. And so we've learned something from our doing business ranking. You know, that's my busiest week of the year is the week before the doing business rankings come out. Because that's when we go and we tell the countries where they're going to be ranked. And then, you know, it's not like basketball games. You know, the reason I always say, why do you think the coaches yell at the refs? It's because it works, right? And unfortunately, it doesn't work with us, but the heads of state and ministers of finance believe that they have to at least give it a try to yell at the refs. And so they call me every year and say, you can't possibly tell me that we're ranked here. We've done so many things. And so I learned that people pay attention to rankings, especially when the World Bank puts them out. So we're going to do a ranking of countries from 1 to about 189 of our member countries. It's going to be wildly controversial. They're especially for countries that find themselves ranked below other countries that they've always felt superior to, right? And so we want to start a conversation. We don't want them to stop investing in infrastructure. We want them to take seriously investing in health and education, but in this case, health. And if we can increase the amount of private sector financing coming in for infrastructure in developing countries, they'll have the space to do it. But also, if they get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, which are regressive, if they get rid of some agricultural subsidies, which are often very regressive, if they do things like put on a tobacco tax, Mike, that you know so much about, if you do those things, and then if you start collecting taxes at a rate that's reasonable, I mean, basically, in many countries, the only people who pay taxes are the people who are too weak to refuse to pay taxes. So if you collect taxes and do those things, if we crowd in private sector financing, there will be enough money. And then, it very well could be, you said it the other day, you know, it could be that patients in Rwanda are going to be treated by doctors in Boston. And we're already seeing that. And you know, the one thing that I think we've learned over the past decades is that basically the world is pretty much given up on the notion of equality of outcomes, because it just didn't work out. I mean, if you listen to what President Xi's saying, the Vietnamese, they've said, equality of outcomes didn't work. So if equality of outcomes didn't work, then everyone has to be absolutely committed to equality of opportunity, and that means providing people with decent health care.
Thank you. Let's take a look at that chart of UN Sustainable Development Goals, again, those 17. And Jane, number 5 on that chart is gender equality. Talk a little bit about that. You've spent a large part of your life focused on that area.
Well, maybe I represent it through no fault of my own. But just one comment on healthcare. I think the delivery models have changed totally. And it's a point you made. And technology, in every way, both through using the internet to talk to a doctor in Boston when you're in Africa, but also delivering medicines by drone someplace, and the cell phone and the rest of it has, I think, generated the opportunity for less expensive, much better health care worldwide. And that's one of the few really good news stories. Another one could be gender equality. And obviously I feel strongly about this. Women are a majority of the population, so that makes us, I think, a majority of the talent pool. And it is dumb and lame not to use a majority of the talent pool when you're trying to solve problems. So I've kind of thought about that. And when I was elected to Congress in 1992, it was called the Year of the Woman. Try that. Paul Conrad, who was the vaunted cartoonist for the Los Angeles Times, died a few years ago, did a cartoon which was the state of California, you know what it looks like, with a high heel at the end. And that was to signify the fact that for the first time, California had 2 women senators, Feinstein and Boxer, and a substantial additional number of women members, and the number of women in Congress doubled. The next year, 94, was the Gingrich Revolution, and many of the women who ran, as I did, in open seats lost. So we went backward. But now, Congress has well over 100 women, and more would be better. But at any rate, Congress has changed, and legislatures and governments have changed around the world. And one of the things the Wilson Center has done is, first of all, established something called the Global Women's Leadership Institute. There was no women's platform before I came. But on May 15th, we are publishing a power and parity index, which will show not just how many women there are in senior public service positions in each country in the world, but how much power they hold and what are the pathways to power. And the top countries, of course, you all want to know what they are. They're some of the Scandinavian countries, plus Rwanda. Go figure. Yeah, the U.S. is in the middle, and I actually don't know the lowest ranked country. I don't recall it, but we are investing in statistical research, no fake news, so that we can show country by country where women are gaining power. And obviously there's a long way to go with this, but I think policies change when women are in power across the board, not just in family positions, not that I denigrate that. I'm very proud of the fact that I have 4 kids and 7 grandchildren so far, but also that women make security decisions. It was just wonderful to be at the Munich Security Conference. I know, another good conference, Michael, and this year, and watch the head of that conference, Wolfgang Ischinger, a male, interview the defense ministers of Germany and France, both women. And so that is the change that can happen. And last comment, at the Wilson Center we have a workforce that's 54% female, and we are the first think tank in the world to be EDGE certified. EDGE is a rating service for gender parity in workplaces, and we're very proud of that.
I also think the majority of people around the world, and the people that run our 8 centers around the world, are women at the Milken Institute. Let's take a look at that formula from 65 once again for a moment before we move on, if we could put that up. And let's go to the next one, and let's look at these components of human capital we spoke about. Obviously, education, healthcare, and things like that are listed. Let's go back and look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals now, if we could. And Tidjane, maybe you pick up number 4, quality education.
Okay, no, thank you, Mike. And it's going to be some overlap with what Jane and Jim just talked about. I mean, education is of course vital in everything we're discussing here. And it's not just as traditionally is thought for developing countries. I think it's true for developed countries too. But let me focus on developing countries and maybe illustrate 3 things, because I think it's the passage, if you wish, to solving 3 very delicate issues. There's demography, there is political stability, there's healthcare, and the connections are very strong. If you take demography, the returns on education of girls are close to infinite. I did the demography study in the Ivory Coast when I was in government, and we showed that people always say, oh, Africans have a lot of children, you can't do anything about it, it's cultural. Well, let me tell you something, that is not true.
Not true.
Okay,
Right.
The illiterate African women have 8.2 children. Illiterate African women in the countryside have 8.2 children. Literate, so secondary education, African women in the cities have 2.1. And if you superimpose those curves around the world, they're actually the same.
Yeah.
So any pseudo-cultural speech around demography and natality is not based on sound science. So as you educate women, you get into your demographic transition and the population growth will reduce. And that's directly linked to political stability. Again, I told you I was in government. My president didn't quite like me because in '98 I came and I gave him a report, which was my demographic study. And the report was telling him that he was going to get a military coup. So, which happened 12 months later. And he always thought I was involved. And the physics was very simple. Sorry, but I told you this, Jim, previously. When the IMF came to the Ivory Coast in 1981 and did their first structural adjustment program, you want to balance the budget. The first thing they did was put to zero the education and health budget. Yeah. So there was not one high school built in the country for 14 years. This is a country with a 3.8% population growth rate. Okay? So the population, when I was a child, was 3 million. When I was in government, was 17 million, more than quintupled. Same country, same resources, same territory. So what happens then is that when the kids reached 10, we had to organize a national exam, and we could only take in high school the top 5%. And we had actually established that if you had an IQ below 120, you couldn't go to high school in the Ivory Coast. Wow. Okay? So to go from that to you're going to have trouble, It doesn't take a genius. That's what the report told him. And
Exactly.
to close that story, I remember the soldier who arrested me. I'll never forget him. I was a cabinet member. He came with a machine gun and his bandana, and it's kind of, you're under arrest. I said, okay. And I looked at him and I said, how old are you? And he said, I'm 17, sir. And he was bang in the cohort I'd been analyzing and saying, you know, these people are going to create trouble. Because if you have uncontrolled demography with no opportunity, what you get is trouble. So really, education, finally healthcare, a lot of healthcare problems are education problems in disguise. One thing we were fighting on was child mortality. The first cause of child mortality is dehydration because of the diarrhea. Okay, and most African mothers think that if the child has a diarrhea, you don't give the child water. It kind of makes sense, okay? But it's completely wrong. So, you know, the education campaigns that explain to them that actually they need to give them salt and water to balance the fluids in their body so that they wouldn't lose all their bodies. Diarrhea has never killed anybody, dehydration does. So this is again a healthcare problem.
And sugar, by the way.
Sorry, and sugar.
I don't want anyone here just to give water and salt, okay? It's salt, water, and sugar.
Yes, but this is the expert, but it's a, the point is that so many of those problems that we tackle further down the road at the source are education problems. So, and my final word about the developed world is just that people tend to think this is only a developing world issue. I think that if you look at populism and the roots of populism, there are some connections with education, but I'll stop here.
Absolutely.
So let's take a look at a slide. That work was done by Robert Fogel, a Nobel Prize winner of the University of Chicago, and really looked at the growth of world populations and the history of technology. And you can see here, if you look at this slide, that really for almost thousands of years, there was little growth in the world's population, which is on the left-hand axis, and little growth in really per capita income of the world's economy at that period of time. And so the idea that the world was growing and there was some growth rate, and we're destined to grow at a certain rate of return, either in population or in economy, really didn't exist. And you can see here, really beginning in the 1800s, with a number of inventions talking about some of the areas we've discussed, but germ theory, penicillin, other types of things that occurred that allowed for a substantial increase. I'm a little disappointed, Jim, I don't see different forms of financial structures on this list here. But just the idea that you're going to have growth, and that growth is going to exist regardless of education, healthcare, and other elements today. Now, in folklore, there was this thought that Einstein, when asked what was the most powerful force the world ever produced, and I've gone back to focus on this growth and prosperity to something we had put up in 2001, 17 years ago at the Global Conference. And so we gave a bunch of formulas, but when asked this question, his answer was that it was really compounding, was the most powerful force. This is not your normal financial formula, that this is your real growth formula, and in so many ways, it is the most powerful, as we discussed, growth in the economy, creation of jobs, but it also exists in a world Jim lived in and I live in terms of how fast is your cancer growing? Is it doubling in a month like melanoma or a long period of time? And likewise, or is it decreasing from that standpoint? And so we tried to give you something that people could better understand at that period of time once we understood what was the most powerful force in the world. And by the way, we should put up the financial formula that people are much more familiar with, A equals PE to the RT. And I know most of you are thinking about that all the time. We know our global capital markets group is. So when we step back and ask, okay, how can this be applied? So we looked at Elvis Presley, if you remember, in 2001. So Elvis Presley died in 1977. It was a sad day, Jane, when that happened. Do you remember that? And there were people that listed, this is on their tax return in the United States, that their occupation was Elvis Presley impersonator. So this is your question. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. We have a lot of territory to cover right now. But think in your own mind, the king, Elvis Presley, has died. How many people on their U.S. tax return list their job as Elvis Presley impersonators? You all have your idea. The answer was 174. Now, by 2001, so we're now talking 24 years have gone by, we now do a quick analysis to find out how many people list on their tax return Elvis Presley impersonator as their occupation. Answer, 84,000, okay? 84,000. Okay, and so the idea was, okay, what are growth rates? If growth rates are everything, okay, what are they growing? Now, I'm not going to do the math for you, but if it continued to grow at the same rate, by 2050, 1 in every 3 people on the planet would be Elvis Presley impersonator. But this miracle
we'll make this a new World Bank program. This is the future of work, right?
Yeah.
So I know, Tidjane, you've done a lot of work in looking at considerable variations in health distributions across countries, regions. Could you maybe walk us through a little of the work you've done?
Yeah, it's
Let's start with slide 3.
yeah. Can I have slide 3, please? It's an attempt. I think some of you will be familiar with it. It's a way. It's very difficult to compare GDP across geographies and across time. So what you try to do here is to have GDP per capita in real dollars across countries. So this tells you that fundamentally China, I mean, I'm speaking from memory, but it's about like the US in 1950 in terms of GDP per capita. So if you think that you have 1.3 billion Chinese, that's actually quite an achievement to take 1.3 billion human beings on average to that level. The other side of that chart that's interesting is the dynamic chart. So if you go back 25 years, so call it late 1990, mid-90s, say 1990, and you look at the GDP per capita in China, it was like in the US in 1820. Right? So in 25 years, we've gone from GDP per capita like the US in 1820 to like the US in 1950. And I often say China has delivered 130 years of American economic progress in 25 years.
Right.
Every time people talk to me about the pressures of the Chinese leadership, and I say, look, any political leadership that can do that is in an okay place around the planet. You can deliver 130 years of American progress in 25 years, pretty good. So that's what the analysis is, and we can take slide 4, and you can play this game with various countries. You can see the bubbles, and they bounce, and some go further, and some go closer. You can look at Indonesia, it's one I like. You see Indonesia, it's about the same. They jumped by from 1900 to 1950, so 50 years in 15 years, okay? On a per capita basis. It's what I call the growth escalator. But the engine behind that is the emerging middle classes, and this is something you often talk about, Yong Kim too. But there is a huge strategic message there. And if we can move maybe to slide 5. People ask me often why I talk so much about wealth management. A bit like your Willie Houghton, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is, or a banker. But anyway, why are you focused on wealth? Because there's a lot of wealth being created. It's good to put some numbers on it. If you go, this is the personal financial assets of people with more than $1 million. So relatively well-off people. From 06 to 16, they grew by $26 trillion. You know, US GDP is what, 16, 17 trillion? So it gives you a sense, they basically doubled, more or less. The wealth, if you told people that in 10 years we've doubled the wealth of the world, they don't necessarily have those metrics in mind. But the next slide is actually, for me, even more interesting. It shows you a breakdown of the 26. It's 17 and 9. It's 17 in emerging economies and 9 in developed economies. So yes, there is a huge stock of wealth in the developed economies, and it is growing. 9 trillion is, it's no small change, it's real money. But 17 is much more than 9, and there is every reason for everything we discussed here, demography, technology, to believe that these are long-term trends. One thing we are trying to do, though, at Credit Suisse is still embryonic, but it's really when I talk about being the bank for entrepreneurs, we believe most of this wealth is created by entrepreneurs. Actually, it is. We can demonstrate that. And what we're trying to do is really to accompany them, both in developing their businesses, which we do a lot, but also in managing their private wealth. And when you can do both, it's very good, and it's starting to show in our results. Final comment, maybe, if you may, Mike? Yeah? On the slide 7. This is a slide on impact investing, which is something you hear a lot about, but I hope it doesn't become just a fad or a gimmick, because it's all my experience on the field, being born in developing countries, working in various developing countries, that there is something there, and that there is exactly what you said, Jim, the demographic imbalances of the West, the fact that the European economies are crumbling under the weight of welfare, and the lack of long-term value-creating investment opportunities. There's clearly a market failure there. Mm-hmm. And I spent quite a bit of time working on how do you get that capital to move and to invest itself in really good causes. But I think there is something there, and hopefully we'll talk about it more at future conferences.
So one of the challenges that we're putting forth as we think about a world in transition, that's our focus at this conference, is that the growth in parts of the world is essential in order for the mature, developed world to continue, even with the economic systems and government systems it has. And so tomorrow, our very concluding panel is really going to focus on the Middle East and Africa, the youngest part of the world, and the necessity, if there's 2 billion additional people on this planet by the end of the century, or 3, almost all of them will be in this part of the world, or they'll be someplace else on the planet. And the need, I think, as Tidjane has pointed out, for impact investing, but also to focus. If you want increased rates of return, you need to focus on emerging markets. Jane, for years we've sought to help investors understand the difference between perception and reality. For instance, in Africa, how people perceive the world today might be quite different. If we need to get an education on a cashless world, we'd probably be better off going to Kenya to get started than someplace in the United States. And I know Africa is one of the focuses of attention. Tell us a little bit how Woodrow Wilson looks at Africa and what you see as your responsibilities there.
I'd love to do that. Can I just quibble a little bit with what your introduction, though, which was, as I heard it...
You don't have to take any hypothesis as fact. You can challenge all of them.
The contrary
as a 9-time member of Congress, I would expect that to be the case.
Well, first of all, in Congress, appearance and reality converge, and there really is no reality in certain ways. It is not a learning institution. The business model is broken. That's my view. Not all the people are broken. But if the paradigm is to blame the other side for not solving the problem, and both parties do this, because if you work with the other side, you're bipartisan, which makes you target practice in your primary. And a lot we could talk about, but that's not the subject here. That's one point. My other point, though, is I thought you said, Michael, that we have to understand emerging markets so that mature markets can continue to survive. Maybe
what I was saying really was
right.
If the entire growth of the world's population is going to be in the Middle East and Africa, So if we're going from 1 billion, the UN has indicated could be as high as 4 billion, but let's just say it's 3 billion people. We have countries like Uganda where median age is 15.
Right.
Okay, so this growth, and if Nigeria continued at the same growth rate, within 100 years, it'd have a higher population than China. So the issue really is, if we think the world's going to be stable in the United States, if we don't create opportunities in Africa and the Middle East, there'll be no stability in the United States, there'll be no stability in Europe, etc.
The point I was trying to make is there may be better models, and we might learn some of those from the emerging markets and from this youth bulge that you are correct in saying is in the Middle East and Africa. I think I'm right that half of the world's population growth between now and 2025 will be in Africa. Africa is 54 countries, most people don't know that, and about half of them, I don't know as much as the folks to my right, about half of them are quite successful. The other half, the half that I focus on, and from my intelligence and security background in North Africa and in the Sahel, are breeding grounds for terrorism and sadly have some failing or failed governments. But the good half is a story none of us learns, and that is tragic. And so the Wilson Center, which has a Mature Africa program led by a Zambian-born woman who was a Rhodes Scholar, try that, focuses a lot on the good news story and on how to create rule of law, stable government where leaders eventually move on and have succession. That just happened in Liberia, by the way. A woman moved on, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, whom most view as a quite successful leader. But at any rate, we focus on what can be done, the governance piece, but also the private sector capital markets piece to encourage investments, including local investments in these economies. And so far, at least as best I can tell, and I learn a lot from Mande Mnangagwa, who is this marvelous leader of our Africa program, so far there's a very good story to tell. And sadly, the very little of that gets into the US press.
So a few years ago now, we set up a partnership at the Milken Institute with the World Bank and IFC. And our goal was if we could train 1,000 leaders in finance that could hold their own with anyone, who went back to work in sub-Saharan Africa for their countries, and Middle East, and South Asia, we could change the world by creating individuals. And Jim, I can't tell you how successful this program has been. But I thought, since we should make new announcements at every one of these sessions, I think you're ready to break a little news today about another partnership. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, and I hope Tidjane will talk a little bit about it as well. We started a fantastic conversation with Tidjane and his team at Credit Suisse, and the conversation really started with the idea that you have a lot of millennials who are inheriting lots of money, but they want to have an impact for example, in developing countries in Africa. And so we're announcing today something that we call DT for D, Disruptive Technology for Development. And the donations came from many of Tidjane's clients. But what we're doing is we're really looking at disruptive technologies that could transform and allow developing countries to leapfrog generations of either bad or inefficient practice. Let's just give you an example. So there was a company called Zipline, and this company called Zipline literally are a bunch of rocket scientists. They are actual rocket scientists. And what they have come up with is a drone system. And the drone system, they look like mini airplanes, but they figured out a way of delivering blood anywhere in Rwanda within about 30 minutes. And so it solved so many problems, because in order to be able to deliver blood that quickly, you either have to have huge storage facilities with lots of different types of blood, or roads that can deliver them. And their they really just leapfrogged a whole generation, and now they're building even bigger drones, and they're going to be able to deliver more types of medical equipment. So this fund is to look for those kinds of technologies and then bring innovators, bring investors, and bring our own teams in those countries together to see if we can find more of those examples. We're thrilled about this. I mean, we're a big bank, but we don't have funding for this kind of activity, and so we're really grateful to Tidjane and
I just
folks
want
at
to
Suisse.
stress here,
Yeah.
Jane, I think this is one of the points you made. We can learn a lot. And there was a very interesting book written, Innovation at the Bottom of the Pyramid,
Right.
when you are looking for new innovations to solve problems. Tidjane, do you have some examples you'd like to
Just a quick
address?
word, really, Jim, we're thrilled to be doing that with you. As Jim said, it's a time to leverage technology for really disruptive change in Africa. I think we have a slide on the road example, but I spent many years of my life building roads in Africa, and actually it's quite easy to build a road. The real challenge is maintaining them. So this is an example of an app that basically allows you to know when there is a pothole in a road.
Can we pull up the slide
pull up
showing
this
another
slide?
example of this disruptive technology, maybe?
Sure. If there's any engineers in the room, you know that the decay from a pothole is really exponential. And if you have one rainy season and traffic on a pothole, your road is gone. So you've invested $20 million, but one pothole has basically destroyed the viability of a road. So this is an example of a road lab. It's called a pilot program that just allows you to crowdsource that information, and when the truck drivers, etc., see a pothole, tell you, so you can go and intervene very quickly. So it's very efficient. So it's smart things. It's not a lot of money. It's a bit of money still. We had a slide on the donor club, and there's a lot of money in this room, and a lot of brains. So I'll be shameless in saying that also, if you have any interest in this idea and helping us, we already have a few clients at Credit Suisse who have committed, but we're very open to getting more support.
So Jim and Tidjane, if your fund is not closed, maybe I'll get a chance to invest with you here, okay?
Would be great.
That'd be great. So today we have three individuals. You've heard their history, quite diverse, who've ended up over the years changing the world as we know it, but also today sit at institutions. And in many cases, whether it's the wisdom of what we've heard as the #1 ranked Woodrow Wilson Institute there in Washington, right down the street from where our new Milken Institute museums will be, whether it's the World Bank that is breaking new ground almost every year here that would have been unheard of before, or whether it's Tidjane, who's taking a financial institution creatively into the 21st century. We're looking forward to what the three of you do in the future. Thank you for joining us here.